So welcome everyone to Coöperism 1113 on rescue at sea. We have an extraordinary program this evening that starts with a celebration of the fact that Howe Haralambous has just defended her dissertation moments ago and is now a doctor. So it's thrilling to have this. We've been working on this session since July, putting it together, bringing people together, and so it's a real treat to be together to celebrate this at the same time. So as you know from reading about the introduction, the blogs, and the introduction that Chloe wrote, we're going to be looking at the kind of interstices of cooperation and the failed and aggressive and brutal state in the Mediterranean with regard to rescue operations there. And to discuss that, we have an extraordinary panel this evening. We have an extraordinary panel of critical thinkers and an activist, people who have been doing this work themselves and who have infused their thinking and their critical thinking by their actions and by the work that they've been doing for years now in the Mediterranean. So Chloe Haralambous has been working on this, and as you will see, on the planes, on the boats, and working critically on this topic for several years now, and has put together programs and projects and that have actually kind of been mobilizing for people to address the problems in the Mediterranean. We're going to be starting this evening with a preview of an extraordinary documentary about this work. And it's been made by Chiara Towne, who joins us this evening from LA, who is a screenwriter and a director and a producer and has created this documentary called Channel 16. Channel 16, as you will find out, is the frequency for the SOS, for the Mayday calls, for the transfer of information in this space. You'll correct me. Okay, all right. And Chiara has been working with Chloe and Miguel and others for 10 years now, seven years now, putting together the footage and putting together the documentary. So that's where we're going to start. Then we're going to go into conversation, starting with Chloe. Then we will hear from Miguel Duarte, who joins us from Portugal. And Miguel is actually a particle physicist, and sort of, yeah. And so, on black holes, which is very fitting for this topic and the Mediterranean. But he has also been dedicating his life to doing rescue at sea operations, and he's been doing it for over 10 years now, blending the physics and the work on saving people. He was on the boat, the Juventus, which led to severe repression by the Italian government and indictments. Unfortunately, he was acquitted of those charges, although other people are still, if I'm not mistaken, under indictment and being pursued criminally for their activities. So we'll hear about that, and we'll hear about the work that you've been doing and how it relates also how the state turns from saving to prosecuting for saving, right? And what the state is actually doing in that work, and kind of asserting its sovereignty, etc. And we're also joined by Lorenzo Pezzani, who joins us from Bologna, yes, And Lorenzo is an architect and a professor at the university there, and he specializes in what's called forensic architecture. And I know you've all heard about forensic architecture and the importance of forensic architecture. So we'll hear more about it and how central it is to addressing these issues, but also defending, right? Because a lot of the work that Lorenzo did was to show how certain claims about what was going on in terms of boat movements and what the folks who are doing the rescue at sea were doing are actually belied by very difficult, detailed forensic work on clouds, right? So you'll explain that all for us, but it's extraordinary work. So I really want to thank you for all four, for the work you do, but also for joining us tonight to think through this. It's extraordinary work. Actually, we're going to give you a round of applause for what you've been doing. Okay. So with that, I think what we should do is preview the documentary.
Minutes, 012 degrees, 16 minutes. Blue wooden boat adrift, 40 people on board in distress, no life jackets. Boat is leaning on its starboard side, immediate assistance required. Mayday relay, over.
And now you wave the wings and we show them the direction of Lampedusa.
Okay, there's nothing more we can do. Let's go.
Such a radio, 1,000 feet, and
I did take some night shifts, keeping watch. And in those moments, there's always some people who can't sleep. But I keep remembering this particular man with whom I had a conversation about the horrors that he lived in Libya. And at some point we were talking about religion and, well, he asked me what my religion was and I said that I had none. And we just went from this really heavy conversation to him laughing at the fact that I didn't believe in God. And he found it completely absurd.
That was stunning. Absolutely stunning. We're going to start with you. I'll move the flowers if it's in your way. All right, everyone. Thank you, Chiara, for that.
Thank you. If anybody has any questions, don't be shy about. There was obviously some frequencies that the speakers in here didn't like, so don't.
Well, I didn't
I have
think
a
they
question?
didn't like the plane engines. Was what
Yeah,
they
it sounded
didn't
like a frog. Yeah, it's odd. That's never happened. I mean, we've tested it, but
Yeah.
please do ask. Is the point.
Yeah, there we go. All right. So what we're going to do is we'll hear from our friends and colleagues. Chloe, you'll start, and then Miguel, Lorenzo, and then we'll come back to you, Chiara. Okay? All right, go ahead. And you're going to need to speak into your mic.
Oh, okay.
So I don't know, now that we've just watched that, I feel like I'd really just rather talk about the documentary, because I think that, I mean, aside from being like aesthetically so beautiful, which Chiara doesn't get anywhere near enough credit for, like shooting from a plane, it's like really very hard. And I don't say this as an expert of any kind, but nevertheless, I've been
She's a
told.
doctor, actually.
I'm a
so-
doctor, in case you didn't get the brief. No. So anyway, so the brief was to be brief and to leave as much time as possible for the discussion. So I thought that what I'd do is to not repeat what I wrote in my blog post, but to just try and fill in some of the historical background that I'm sure Miguel will also be doing, and to offer a couple of ways off the cuff to connect the theory and praxis of solidarity at sea to our theme of coöperism. And I want to do this by returning to the scene of distress itself and to trouble what might be some of our preconceptions about what rescue is. And specifically, I want to unveil this open secret that rescue is not, or not only, about saving life. So it often surprises people to know that in most common law systems, there is no duty to rescue on land. And there's a very nerdy, but also quite illuminating reason for that baked into early modern political theory. The stipulation of the social contract is that citizens, right, I mean, we all know that surrender their right to violence to the sovereign, or in this case, the state, and in return, they expect the sovereign's protection from the violence of others. And that means that a triangulation takes form in my encounter with the other, as it happens within a common understanding that in ceding personal violence to the state, we have also ceded or liberated ourselves from our obligation to protect each other, our responsibility for each other. But on the high seas, outside of territorial borders, that sovereign contract is suspended, and we become again accountable to each other. Sometimes called the human rights encounter, rescue at sea occurs in the absence of the mediating function of the state, and so unfolds at scales that are both intimate and universal. The unmediated relationship between two people who care for each other in the name of a common and abstract humanity. Does my voice sound weird?
No, it sounds perfect.
Okay. I feel like I'm losing it.
So for 2 hours. And
Yeah. So as we've already seen, like humanity is not issue forth spontaneously at the scene of distress. But I want to keep that ideal type rescue situation in mind, first, because it is the scenario most often contemplated in the humanitarian idioms of rescue. And second, because it speaks to the origins of the notion of rescue as a form of coöperism that inspires alternative political practices and imaginaries to those of the nation state. The civil fleet itself began by treating the sea as a commons, a democratic point of access for civil society, engendering this kind of deterritorialized community of care. In 2014, when Italy suspended its state-led rescue operation Mare Nostrum, leaving thousands of people to drown, civil society stepped in to fill the rescue gap. Alongside humanitarian giants like Doctors Without Borders and Save the Children, small grassroots collectives crowdfunded through squats, social centers, human rights collectives, and private donors to buy their own ships and sail into the Mediterranean. So the ships that Miguel and I were first crewed on were the initiatives of mostly very young European activists. So you saw an image of the Juventa, but the Sea-Watch 1, for instance, I mean, now Sea-Watch has this huge kind of practically a ferry. The Sea-Watch 5, they operate 2 aircraft, but Sea-Watch 1 started off as a 20-meter shrimper that was built in 1917 and used to sail the Baltic Sea, and then had been kind of converted into somebody's home in the Dutch canals. So that was the origin of Sea-Watch. And this is partly because the civil fleet flourished at a moment of crisis in the border regime. The so-called refugee crisis, or the long summer of migration, had temporarily overwhelmed Fortress Europe. What was left of the state rescue fleet worked alongside the NGOs and merchant vessels to coordinate rescues and arrange for people's disembarkation to Europe. The vast differences among those actors, right? So the states, the radicals, the anarchists, the humanitarians, could be transcended for the sake of the common sense and crucially at the time apolitical value of saving life. But by late 2016, early 2017, that had begun to change. The border regime was recovering and priorities had shifted definitively to sealing the Mediterranean corridor. And so that meant the European authorities pulled the remaining state ships from the rescue zone, began outsourcing the work of border control to Libya, so we saw the Libyan Coast Guard, and crucially, they began to exclude the civil fleet from their operations. Instead, a task force of international and Italian policing agencies led by the Sicilian anti-mafia launched a web of investigations into the civil fleet, with magistrates alleging that NGOs rescuing refugees were not actually being driven by humanitarian purposes, but they were actually colluding with people traffickers. So drawing from their experience in investigating the mafia, these magistrates, the Anti-Mafia and Anti-Terror Criminal Justice Project, reproposed the cooperative forms of the civil fleet as a criminal association whose operations at sea aimed at substituting the state by seizing its exclusive right to manage its borders. Now, Miguel was personally involved in those investigations, and I think that he wants to talk about criminalization. So I'm not going to go into that, but for now, what I want to stress is that the sudden shift in the relationship between state and NGOs began to exacerbate the tension between humanitarianism and politics that had always implicitly been structuring rescue at sea. So it might be strange to say this given what we just saw, but even though states will actively avoid not doing it, the obligation to save life at sea is in a sense the least contested in border struggles. Most of the political interests and alliances in the rescue zone, those of states, border crossers, activists, and merchants, are expressed in terms of the idioms of saving life. Consider, for instance, the EU's border externalization agreement with Libya, where the interception and return of migrant boats is celebrated as humanitarian intervention or rescue. So we saw this in the documentary. So the Libyan Coast Guard patrol boat that shot on the people, if they had managed to take the people back to Libya, they would have tweeted about it as a rescue. We see later that the Libyan, I don't know if that was audible, like through the foghorn, but there is a moment where another Libyan patrol vessel calls Seabird and is like, hey, can you tell us the position of the migrant boat? Because the weather is changing and it's going to be rough out there and we really need to go and save them, right? And I'm like in this surreal position of being like, but you were just shooting at the people and now you're saying you care about them. And maybe you do because it's different militias. And so maybe a different guy got crewed on that boat. And often Libyan Coast Guard officers will really think that their colleagues of the rescue fleet were rescuing people. All of which is to say that rescue is not straightforward. And the point is that it's not technically wrong that the Libyan Coast Guard recovers people who might otherwise have made it, who might otherwise have drowned. But this notion is plausible only as long as the event of rescue is abstracted from the political conditions that created it. The reason why people on the move do not only want to live, they want to cross and escape the place to which rescue as a form of capture threatens to return them. An entrenched ideological profile of the worthy beneficiary of European humanitarianism discourages us from pointing out that people on the move in the Mediterranean have or aspire to have some agency in their rescue. In the rescue zone, there are cases where people do not want to be rescued or might want to be rescued under specific conditions which they think will better their chances of reaching Europe. So much as border crossers and rescuers themselves always invoke humanity and saving life as their common ground, solidarity at sea rests on a complex negotiation of national scales involved in the moment of encounter and the kinds of opportunities that specific encounters afford. In 2012, the court ruling on Kirsi Jamal versus Italy established that when a migrant encounters a European asset at sea, for all legal purposes, she enters into that flag state, is subject to its jurisdiction, and thus has the right not only to be rescued, but to seek asylum. She cannot be returned. So in the film, the distance between the Libyan patrol vessel and Sea-Watch 4 is about a mile. But for all legal purposes, that's the distance between Libya and Italy, between Africa and Europe. Rescuers carry their flag state authority, law, and obligations on their bodies. Their body is the border. Their responsibilities are triggered wherever they find themselves in a position of power over another. So for both rescuers and border crossers, solidarity at sea, at times compared to an underground or submarine railroad, is not the fact that I saved someone's life, but that my willing exposure to the other's claim offers her entry into the political community she desires, and that's Europe. So here we're speaking mostly of the confrontation between the civil fleet and the state. And so basically the civil fleet trying as much as possible to get there before the Libyan Coast Guards to stage that moment of encounter. But the submarine railroad I'm describing quietly joins border crossers and seafarers across the Mediterranean, creating new, even transient political communities and imaginary. So the last boat that you see in the film, the one that we catch like a few moments before sunset, we were informed of that boat when an unknown seafarer flagged their coordinates to Sea-Watch's general queries address, specifying, this email is anonymous. I just send it because I cannot accept omerta. Please do something. So omertà is like the vow of secrecy that the vow of enforced secrecy that the mafia has, for those of you who. So he said, this email is anonymous. I just sent it because I cannot accept omertà. Please do something. When Sea-Watch attempted a reply, the email bounced back. The coordinates were really in the Far East in a sparsely trafficked stretch of sea. But reconstruction of maritime traffic from that day showed that around the time the email was sent, only one ship, an offshore supply vessel, had transited close enough to the boat's position to spot it. It was likely that company's policy not to report sightings of boats in distress in order to avoid having to rescue them. Now, we cannot know what position Aeneas Ambrose, which was the alias that was adopted by our informant, held on the ship, and whether his decision to name himself after Virgil's refugee hero Aeneas was deliberate, or what motivated him to join the dozens of fishermen and other merchant sailors who secretly communicated the coordinates of boats in distress to the rescue fleet in violation of their orders, or who rescued people themselves, later refusing to hand them over to the Libyan Coast Guard. At the height of the criminalization campaign against NGOs, and as Italy's far-right minister closed the country's ports to arriving refugees, low-ranking officers of border enforcement agencies began to leak their own intelligence to rescue activists, informing them of the coordinates of migrant boats that were attempting the crossing. My point is that we can productively think of the rescue wars not as an instance of totalizing state violence or depoliticized mass disaster, but rather as a struggle between two forms of coöperism. On the one hand, the agreement among European member states, their implementing partners, and at times the giants of the global shipping industry. And on the other, the vast network of solidarity that spans migrants, activists, fishermen, and maritime laborers, working often quietly and in the margins to be just, to defend the lives of strangers in their struggle for freedom. That's my brief. Thank you.
Thank you, Chloe, for complicating the matters so productively in terms of how cooperation actually operates at multiple levels in this space, including among the European nations and among the military fleets, right? So the different forms of cooperation that are at play, that are struggling with each other. And I think that's really important because you can never really speak about cooperation only in the forms that we value, but we also need to think of them as the forms that we are opposing in a way through cooperation. So that was very helpful, and also to understand all of the different dynamics that are at play. One of the amazing pieces of the documentary is the way in which you really get a sense that some of the persons who are on these boats would rather risk it and die than than be picked up in the wrong way. Miguel, why don't you tell us a little bit about your work and also this question of the criminalization of these operations. Thanks for joining us.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start by giving a little bit more of a historical perspective on civil sea rescue. As Chloe already said, back in 2013, 2014, there was this state-led search and rescue organization or operation that was basically paid for by the European Union, and it was conducted by the Italian Navy and Coast Guard. In comparative terms, it was very, very effective in the sense that over the course of 1 year, it rescued over 150,000 people. And in October 2014, it was swiftly canceled by the pressure of some European leaders. And a lot of disastrous shipwrecks took place once more. And this is the void of humanitarian aid in which the first NGOs started appearing. Sea-Watch was the first one, but quickly some others followed, like some big ones like Doctors Without Borders and Save the Children, and some other small ones like the one I began working with that operated that ship Juventa that you just saw. So the states retracted from this responsibility of performing search and rescue operations, but not completely. They didn't retract completely of the responsibility like all in one go. So Back then, I started in the summer of 2016, and over the course of that year, so from mid-2016 to mid-2017, I was involved with the crew of the Juventa. And when I started, there was this kind of, there was this collaboration between state actors and civil society actors like the NGOs, in the sense that the vast majority of the cases, so there were no NGO planes back then, like Seabird. And so back then, the vast majority of the cases that we rescued, the coordinates were first given to us by the so-called MRCC, which is the Maritime Rescue Coordination Center, and it's part of the Italian state. So they would give us the coordinates. They would tell us, there's a distress case here, please go and rescue. And we would find the people, rescue them, and communicate back to the MRCC as soon as possible, tell them how many women, children, men we had on board and the medical conditions, and they would provide us with a bigger ship, say a Coast Guard ship or a Navy ship, that would meet us at high sea and bring the people safely to shore, while leaving us free to keep patrolling international waters. And over the course of that year in which I was active with the crew of the Juventa, I really saw the slow erosion of this collaboration between states and civil society. And that, I think, came very much hand in hand with the growth in this anti-immigration sentiment, and which also came hand in hand with this anti-NGO sentiment. So there was this increasing demonization, let's say, of the NGOs, in particular in Italy, in public discourse in Italy, but also in general in most countries in Europe. And so, you know, as months went by, we got less and less information from the Italian authorities. So we were a little bit blind at some point in terms of where distress cases were located. And also, once we had conducted a successful rescue operation, we would get close to no help from authorities. And many times we had very difficult situations in which we were completely overwhelmed with boats around us. So for example, the Juventa where I was working, it was built so the stability calculations for the ship allow us to take on board at most 120 people. And for 2 times we had more than 500. Just really, obviously everybody knew that was dangerous, but it was not something that was a choice for us, because we were completely overwhelmed with boats. And even in those times, even in those very dire moments, we didn't have the help that we needed from state actors, and that's probably in the previous year we would have had. Then along came August 2nd, 2017, when the Juventa was forced by the Italian authorities to berth in Lampedusa, and was seized, was confiscated by the Italian police. And the crew was informed that we were under investigation for human trafficking, aiding and abetting illegal immigration, and possession of firearms. So back then we had no idea what was going on. It was all very confusing. But then, you know, slowly we started realizing that what it was. And the first thing that became very obvious was that our case was not very special. It was just the first one, in the sense that between 2017 and 2018, every single NGO that was active in the Central Mediterranean got criminalized, got either indicted or accused of one of these crimes. So so much so that by the end of 2018 there were no active crews in the Central Mediterranean. That fortunately changed about a year later. So this is kind of what I wanted to get at, this criminalization of NGOs. I think a naive look at this back in 2017 would make us think that this was kind of a new phenomenon to some extent. But I think the criminalization of NGOs and the criminalization of solidarity is best understood as part of the criminalization, or as a new iteration of the criminalization of migration itself, which is a much older and much greater phenomenon. And so what I wanted to analyze a little bit here is why this criminalization. again, naively, we could analyze the speeches of the establishment parties, so the governing parties in most countries in Europe, like the center left and the center right, and a lot of them will say that we need to keep the migrants out, and this is the reason why there's this increase in criminalization, and why do we need to keep the migrants out? There will be different answers, but one that's very common is because we need to keep the far right at bay, right? And if we let the migrants in, then the far right is going to rise. I think the truth is a little more complex than that, in the sense that if you look at the deportation rates, the deportation numbers in most countries in Europe, you see that the numbers of people who are deported by European countries are negligible as compared to the number of arrivals, irregular arrivals in particular. So Italy, for example, which is a main entry in the European Union, it's hundreds of thousands of arrivals every year, makes basically no deportations. So what happens is, say, take a person that we rescued in a rescue operation in the Central Mediterranean. We rescue the person, we take that person to a safe port in Italy, the person is disembarked and is taken to a center where they can ask for asylum, as people generally do. But the majority of the people don't qualify for asylum, so they get the asylum request gets requested, it gets rejected, and the people are handed this notification to abandon the country. So say in 2 weeks. It's just that things don't work that way, and smuggling networks don't work both ways, and also many of these people have nowhere to go back to. So the vast majority of people end up staying where they are. They just don't count for statistics because legally they're not there. And so what these people end up doing, they end up building part of this increasing workforce in Europe that is still working, but has no rights. It's a very particular form of labor because it's migrant labor that has no labor rights. In Portugal, for example, so a migrant can come in and they can have a legal work contract, paying social security, paying taxes, without having a residence permit, meaning they can work legally, but they cannot stay there legally. This is absurd, of course, but it's something that can happen for 3 to 4 years for any given migrant that gets into the country. And this is a small country, and we're talking about 300,000 to 400,000 people who are in this particular situation. And this is clearly not unique in Europe. This is actually the case for probably millions of people. Nobody knows how many, right? So really, I think when we say that the establishment in Europe is anti-immigration, I think that's not really true. I think they're much better described as anti-migrants' rights than anti-immigration. And the reason is very material. It's to get cheap labor. So the European border system is not so much designed to keep people away as it is to keep people without their rights. And then racism, xenophobia were never the goals in themselves. They're just all of this anti-immigrant narrative is just a tool. It takes the form of this criminalization, and it legitimizes, according to public opinion, treating these people as criminals. Right? If we create no legal ways for people to cross, they will still come because they have to. But we legitimize treating them as criminals and taking away their rights. Right? And so I think it's become increasingly obvious over the last few years that making the crossing harder doesn't mean that less people will come. It just means that more people will die, and that's what's been happening. That's why this particular border, the Mediterranean Sea, and in particular the Central Mediterranean, has become so deadly, the deadliest border in the world. So again, the European establishment is not so much anti-immigration as it is anti-migrants' rights. And I think looking at things this way unveils that the European left has failed when it's accepted to frame the debate around migration as letting people enter versus not letting people enter. It was never really about that. People will enter, and everybody knows that. So migrants will cross the border whether we like it or not. And really, I doubt that European governments would be able to change that even if they wanted to. And so the fundamental question is whether people will come as criminals or as equals.
Thank you, Miguel. And the focus on criminalization, I think, is really important. And I'm going to have a few things to say about it. Maybe when we're finished with your presentations, because I think it's probably, at least for me, but surprise, surprise, it's the most important way to kind of put the wedge in what is going on. So maybe I'll talk about that later and pick up on what you were saying. Lorenzo, though, tell us about the work that you did, especially the work in forensic architecture and forensic understanding of kind of what was going on, particularly with this case of the Juventa. Thanks.
Sure, thank you. Before doing that, though, I wanted to say a couple of things, starting from some of the later images of the film, when we see those kind of moments of, fleeting but very intense as well and powerful celebrations, right? Like the moments of joy, the celebrations, because they struck me because they resonate with stories that I've heard as well from many people who have done the crossing, who have told me, in different ways and in slightly different, let's say, configurations, but fundamentally there is a kind of recurring story, which is that many people tell the story of how, once they get on the ship and once they understand, who are the people who are they've been rescued by and what's going to happen after, they are safe in that space and that they will eventually be brought like where they wanted to go. They basically plunge into what has been described by several people, the deepest kind of sleep that they've had in a very long time, right? And I find this image of a kind of profound restoring rest very powerful. Powerful because it recalls, on the one hand, let's say the Brechtian image of humanitarian mission as that of providing a bed for the night, to use the sentence that David Reef famously used to advocate for a sort of, let's say, minimalism of humanitarian intervention, but also because it speaks, I think, of a peculiar space that the rescue ship constitutes, right? Somehow suspended between, on the one hand, the kind of necropolitical violence of abuse, detention in Libya, the risk of the crossing, which have been left, behind, and the yet to come biopolitical regime of state protection, or rather, we should say, unprotection, that will come, after, once they reach European soil, right? So this kind of liminal space of not anymore here, but not yet there, it's a kind of, I find, powerful moment of suspension that has been offered, by the presence of these non-governmental ships, and that has become, for many of those who have, tried to cross the Mediterranean, a space of refuge. A space of refuge which has constantly been under assault by European states and agencies, Libyan militias and whatnot, as we have seen in the film and as Chloe and Miguel have already said, all of whom have somehow tried to reassert their jurisdictions over these floating pieces of territory, right? So it's a powerful image also because it talks about, the complicated relationship that this kind of non-governmental operations have with the state, as we have heard. And the interesting thing is that, the ship being this kind of small kind of floating piece of territory, as long as they remain outside, let's say, a port or more generally territorial waters, they have been able to defend, they are able to defend a certain degree of independence, right? thanks to the fact that on the high seas, the high seas is a space that does not fall squarely under the jurisdiction of any specific sovereign state, right? And so provides somehow these non-governmental actors a certain degree of extraterritoriality. And historically, it's also, I mean, part of my previous research was also looking at, let's say, the kind of longer genealogies of rescue at sea, and in particular how, you know, in the kind of so-called crisis that gave the name of both people, i.e., the crisis in the South China Sea after, you know, the fall of Saigon. You know, that was the moment when this kind of new wave of some frontierism, right, of humanitarianism without borders was really born, right? And some of the protagonists of that phase, like Bernard Kouchner, you know, one of the founder of MSF, and then, you know, one of the champions as well of, let's say, kind of more, let's say, state-led military humanitarian intervention, you know, really found, let's say, a productive ground to start to implement some of the ideas that they started to elaborate initially on a more theoretical level, right? So let's say ship that remains, you know, on the high seas as this opportunity, but at the same time, as it also became immediately clear, you know, in the South China Sea, and as it's very clear in the Mediterranean as well, in the moment in which they enter port and they arrive on the shore, then this is the moment when criminalization happens, when, you know, the state kind of reasserts somehow its power, right? But still, you know, there's something, let's say, I think, specific to the, you know, materiality, to the territoriality of the sea that makes these kind of forms of cooperation possible, right? You were asking, Chloe, in your you know, essay, you know, what kind of form of cooperation does the sea allow, right? And I think this is maybe one example of that. And also because, you know, holding that space, that kind of liminal space that I was describing, has been a kind of eminently cooperative endeavor, right? That has been made possible, you know, really by the sharing and the putting in common of a myriad of, let's say, specialized knowledges and practices across a wide range of, let's say, communities of practice, right? And I mean, you know, the film, I think, shows that very, very clearly and very eloquently. But, you know, I've witnessed myself, you know, you were both saying, like, at the beginning, a lot of these organizations were led and were, you know, made by very young kind of activists who mostly didn't know anything about the sea, about, you know, maritime laws, about, you know, aviation, about, you know, floating devices, about engines of ships, about refugee laws, and so on and so forth. And in a matter of, let's say, a few weeks, they have become, you know, some of the most eminent experts in these fields that you can imagine. So, you know, this kind of, let's say, yeah, kind of sharing of practices, of knowledges has been a kind of fundamental feature of this moment. Now, if I, you know, try to think more specifically about my own work and how that relates as well to certain forms of cooperation in this space, I need to start by, let's say, inviting you to think about the space of the border as an aesthetic space, right? What do I mean by that? I mean that borders are social constructs, social devices that operate as well aesthetically. They, you know, in a kind of Rancièrean sense, right? They produce specific partitions of the sensible. They create specific conditions of visibility and invisibility, of audibility and inaudibility, of appearance and disappearance, right? Certain subjects appear, certain subjects disappear. Certain subjects are audible, certain are not audible. And these became acutely clear to me in the context of these projects that I've been conducting since 20 2011 under several names: forensic, oceanography, architecture, then border forensics, and now with this new kind of research center that I've established recently in Bologna that we call LIMINAL, through which we have tried to critically investigate the militarized border regime in the Mediterranean, documenting and in some way trying to challenge as well the spatial, aesthetic, and political conditions that have turned this space of the Mediterranean into a deadly border. So this kind of aesthetic dimension of borders is something that, of course, search and rescue NGOs have been acutely aware themselves, right? They have been acutely aware of the role of critical witnesses in this space. We have seen, again, in the film, there's a lot of cameras, there's a lot of filming, there are a lot of, images that get produced because these rescue groups have equipped themselves with cameras and somehow turn their vessels into veritable recording devices. And if I can have the slides that right. So here you see, just as an example, a kind of plan of the Sea-Watch 3, I believe, and with the placement of some of the cameras that were mounted on its various masts and on the various kind of components, right? So all of these cameras were, or most of these cameras were kind of constantly recording and producing a lot of images of events that were happening at sea. Fundamentally, in this way, transforming the space of the sea and claiming and exercising somehow a critical right to look there where the state had said that there was nothing to see, right? Traditionally a space like the space of the sea that, where only kind of state agencies had the possibility to look and to see what was happening, now was being reclaimed with the arrival of the rescue NGOs as a space where others also had the right to see and to look, right? So this has produced a deluge of images and sound coming from the Mediterranean. So, while in our first investigations, in the early 2011 and 12, etc., we had to rely on remote sensing because there was no image of the events. Here at some point after 2015, 2016, when more and more NGOs started to take the sea, we started to be inundated by, more and more hours and hours of footage, terabytes and terabytes of recordings, right? And so our role as well shifted from trying to uncover events that were happening in the absence of external witnesses to instead assembling truth claims from a college of fragments, each of them holding precious information through some sorts of, inscriptions, but each of them nevertheless always kind of incomplete and often distorted, or at least not providing a clear univocal account of events. So we didn't have any kind of smoking gun, right? But we had to kind of piece together, different elements, right? And this really speaks about an idea of that is, at the core of a lot of these forensic practices and other forms of surveillance, right? So not surveillance, but surveillance from below, which are based on a sort of socialization of evidence, right? So again, another form of cooperation where evidence gets produced in a kind of, collective way, right? So in the case of the Juventus specifically, right, we, our work was really try to piece together all of these images to contrast the narrative that had been, propagated by the Italian state, which mainly, was, incarnated or got represented, let's say, very well by this one image that was distributed widely on the press, where, the Italian prosecutors claim that this is the Juventa rib, the lily, as it was called, that was kind of towing, that empty boat back to Libyan coasts right, to return the empty boat to the evil kind of traffickers. So somehow showing a sign of kind of collusion with this kind of trafficking circles, right? So what we did was using 3D modeling as a sort of scaffolding to recompose the various images and videos that the Juventa crew had passed on to us, and that were documenting the scenes for which the Juventa was incriminated. First cross-referencing and geolocating all of them, and then moving between these different visual elements with the scene somehow pivoting around these multiple anchoring points. And I'm going to play now a short video without sound. I mean, we don't have really time to go into the specifics of the events, but I invite you to maybe watch the full video, which is online. You'll find it on Forensic Architecture website. But what what I wanted to, hopefully, if it plays. Oh no, sorry, it's next one. Where I can, or the other one. No, below. Sorry, I made a mistake. It's probably just like one of more. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I lost it. Maybe the next one. Yes, this one. Basically, I mean, all I wanted to show you is this kind of process of, let's say, using the 3D modeling as scaffolding to recompose, these various points of view. And I think what is, interesting here is that, we see that, because each of these single image, doesn't contain all the events, right? Because of the weaknesses of the sensors that, counter-forensic practices use and are built upon, alliances between different communities and knowledges and practices needs to, come in, each with their own specific standpoint and situated perspective, but attuned to shared ways of sense-making in common, right? And so I guess what we see emerging here slowly is a kind of form of truth that is neither subjective nor objective, but really collective, right? A truth that does not appear as a moment of absolute revelation, but rather as a slow, painstaking, and open-ended process of verification that assembles and cross-references multiple and often contradicting sources, and a truth that is not afraid of showing the cracks and fissures that marks it and that makes it fragile, and yet, in spite of that fragility, or maybe perhaps because of that, hopefully not less powerful, right? So this is what I wanted to show, by showing you briefly this video and seeing how, from that very image, that was extrapolated, from the context by the Italian prosecutors in a way that, we argued constituted a factual lie, i.e., that image represented something that happened, right? But when you reinsert that image within that broader context, what you see is, in fact, that the Lily was towing the boat not towards the Libyan coast, but rather, actually in a northerly position, but most importantly, back to the Juventa ship itself when, where, it was going to be marked as it was standard practice at the time during rescue operations, right? So, the direction and the purpose of the towing was completely different, right? And it was possible to tell that story only for the Italian prosecutor, only by extrapolating that one image out of that broader kind of context. I think I'll stop there because it's also, already a bit late with time. Yeah.
Fascinating work. Yeah, So let's come back then to Chiara to say a few words about your work.
About my work, no,
Yes.
we'll take some questions about the movie, but I mean, imagine my chagrin speaking amongst these three PhDs, thinking what I could possibly have to add to this set of minds from, you know, being from where I'm from, i.e. Hollywood. But I have been sitting here thinking about the theme of this conversation, and as I'm sitting here at Columbia, where Chloe and I met when we were 19 years old. 18, you were 19, wow. Still a year older than her as well. She's 29 in the footage, by the way. So that's sort of where I'm going with this, which is that I think what is really important to consider is that both of these people sitting on either side of me chose to do this work and had to figure out how to do it themselves. And there's nothing that compares to sitting on a plane next to one of your best friends in the world as she tries to understand where a boat that might have launched from Libya 12 hours previously and then been swept by the currents that we think are correctly mapped, and then also calculating the wind that would have been in place. This is a person who was trained in the humanities. And I think I guess all I want to say is that it is shocking how much people can do when they work together and put their minds to it. And I think particularly with everything that continues to go on in the world and in this country, because I'm Italian, but I'm obviously also American. I guess that's what I would hope any audience might take away from the film, is that we're not trained by any government to do this work, and they figured out how to do it. That's all I have to say before we open the
Yeah, and that was amazing. The mom giving birth on
Yeah.
and that was just, I mean, and of course you were part of it too, Megan. So, but that gives a beautiful arc to your documentary.
So that is an event that does take place, and Chloe's probably better positioned to speak to how often, but the cliche of adrenaline forcing a pregnancy to term is real, and people actually have given birth in those boats before and even certainly after. I think what is particularly unique about her, obviously, is her grace and ability to so succinctly articulate her own journey and what happened in an interview that took place 2 months after that birth. I would agree.
Yeah, yeah. Amazing documentary. Good. But before we do, I mean, before, of course, and anyone should feel free to kind of jump in, but then before we open it up, I did want to say just a few thoughts, because I was particularly interested in the way in which the criminalization of the NGOs gives us a particular wedge into understanding, I think, what's going on as an outsider. And it has to do with really severing the link. I started to write about it. It's in the introduction. I started to write about it, but I'm thinking more and more about it. It's about severing the link between the notion of safety and security and saving migrants who are at risk of death, right? And the government enforcement of its policies. And of course, in a way, the common sense view is to think that these are related, right? What the government is doing is enforcing laws against smuggling, enforcing laws against trafficking in order to enhance the safety, in order to avoid deaths, in order to, fulfill its function, the function of the state, which is to provide security. right? And of course, that's what we're all taught. That's what we're all taught to think. That's how we're all taught to think. And that is the common sense understanding that the government is simply enforcing, that the government is securing, right? Now, of course, during this conversation, we realize that it's not. But it's in severing that link that we can then start to ask the questions of what this government activity is all about, really. In the same way in which thinkers in the field of critical criminal theory did throughout the 20th century, right? I mean, the most important move in the space of crime and punishment, in the theories of punishment, in thinking about punishment, in thinking about crime, the single most important critical move is to sever the relationship between crime and punishment, which we're always taught. It's the reason for punishment. You punish because of a crime, and because of a crime, you punish. And that's at the heart of, and that's the heart of our liberal understanding today of the world. That is what punishment is about. And of course, critical thinkers spent the 20th century trying to sever that link. That was the most important task that they were doing. W.E.B. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction in America, right, is trying to sever the link to show that the forms of punishment that evolved after emancipation and during Reconstruction, the forms of punishment of convict leasing and prison plantations, right? These forms of punishment, they were not about crime, right? They were about reestablishing a form of slavery. They were about recreating a social order. And it's very blatant the way that W.E.B. Du Bois demonstrates it and shows it. I mean, convict leasing is specifically the sale of a person, but simply for a certain amount of time because they've been convicted of a crime, right? And that's what he was trying to show, that actually punishment and the criminal law it was nothing about crime. It was about enforcing a new social order or the old social order. Of course, that's what the Frankfurt School, Rusch and Kirchheimer, were doing in their incredible book, Punishment and Social Structure. They were trying to show that punishment is not about crime, it's about labor supply for them. And they developed a complicated and the whole cottage industry of work on the way in which prison numbers of persons incarcerated are related to labor demands for labor, et cetera. Of course, they also showed other ways in which, like sentencing men to the galleys was actually asked for by the king because he needed rowers for his ships, right? Angela Davis in 1970, when she's writing from the Marin County Jail, was doing precisely the same thing, trying to sever the link between crime and punishment. The punishment that was going on, the punishment of the Panthers, the punishment of George Jackson, et cetera, her own punishment was not about crime or criminality. It was about enforcing a racial order, right? And of course, Michel Foucault does this. That's what Discipline and Punish is about. It's the first step. He says it himself in the introduction in about page 24, right? It's like Rusch and Kirchheimer taught us that you have to sever the link between crime and punishment. And you can't think about these things if you don't start there. And in a way, that's what this work does and shows, because it becomes then, well, okay, so it's not, so in the very same way, it's not about security, safety, and the enforcement of anti-smuggling laws, right? There's something else going on, other functions of governing, other functions of territoriality and sovereignty, of establishing territoriality and sovereignty. All the things that we've been talking about here are in a way, the functions that are served by once by the enforcement, once you've severed the umbilical cord that is, for us, it's always so hard to sever. It's about reconstituting forms of colonialism, right? By getting the Libyans to do the dirty work rather than the Italians, right? So it's by creating a Libyan Coast Guard or something like that. It's by negotiating power it's all about negotiating power relationships between Italy and the other European states within the European Union, right? So it's all there are other things that are working, that are being done, of course. And that was, in part that was because the intervention doesn't even punish. It's not like, the prison is not a failure. It's that you're asking the wrong question about what it does, right? And in a way, these policies are not failures. We're just asking the wrong question about what they're doing. So this is really rich and productive, because I think that particular move is one that can be done in lots of different spaces, right? But it does raise a question to me that I want to ask, because in part where it leads me is that although that all seems that seems right to me, I don't know about whatever I'm arguing it, so it seems right to me, yes, but what's interesting in a way is that it doesn't change much of the equation of what you were doing. In a way, it almost doesn't. In a way, the critical theory there and the critical take and the critical understanding doesn't change for me what you were doing, or the work that needs to be done, which is almost just an ethical obligation, a naked ethical obligation to do the work that you were doing. Is that right, or is that not? Is the okay? Yeah. So go ahead, Chloe.
I have a couple of things to say to that. The first is about the criminalization, and I agree and disagree with Miguel about the criminalization of the NGOs, because it seems to me that on the one hand, the criminalization of NGOs is an extension of the criminalization of migration. On the other hand, I think it also deserves to be understood a little bit in its own dynamics, which is that spectacular criminalization projects that aim in part at creating a precarious workforce and is more easily manipulable, is more easily exploited, usually rely on processes of othering, right? Like criminalization creates others, and so makes them more vulnerable because they have been othered. And one of the distinct elements of the NGOs is that they're not other. And it's not just because they're mostly white middle-class Europeans, but because, as Miguel said, in the kind of history that he gave of the NGOs, they start out doing the things that the state had done, right? So actually, the thing that the state finds most threatening in the NGOs is not their difference, is not the fact that they're like these crazy radicals, right? It's in fact the similarity. And that has a lot to do with the fact of why the anti-mafia of all criminal justice projects becomes interested in criminalizing the NGOs. And the anti-mafia being a traditionally leftist criminal justice project, are not, and I think that we miss part of how the border is actually very messy and creates these spaces of contestation if we understand the border as this kind of like top-down approach of like total repression that misunderstands the ways in which those criminalization processes are always already brought through with contradictions. I don't think that it's like as simple as a kind of like functionalist approach of we must like remove these things from the rescue zone, for instance. I think that the fact that the state goes about and fails, by the way, to criminalize the NGOs, right? Because like the only case that we have of something that has almost gone to trial is still in the pretrial, and the prosecutors themselves have now asked that the case be closed.
After 7 years. Right?
After 7 years. I mean, this
And $3 million.
like this happened a few days ago, like the pretrial ended and the prosecutors were like, okay, sorry, yeah, sorry, this is it. So the point is that this is also a massively failed criminalization project in which incredible resources were expended. So I think that is interesting, but I don't think that really contradicts what you were saying, because I think that those kinds of criminalization projects are ways in which the state tries to figure out what it is. and tries to sort out what is the boundary between civil society and the state, specifically in these cases in which what is being criminalized is not the otherness, it's the sameness. It's the fact that the NGOs have taken over something that is supposed to be a state function. Rescue is supposed to be a public service, basically. The fact that NGOs carry it out is a privatization of a public service. So that is like one element that I want to throw into the mix, which has nothing, which is in no way to kind of undermine Miguel's point about criminalization being an instrument of creating a precarious workforce. But I think that in the case of the NGOs, that criminalization project becomes much more about the state trying to negotiate the boundaries of its own power, its own identity, the fact that these are all liberal states that claim to be acting in the name of humanity, so the NGOs come through and say, well, actually, we're acting in the name of humanity. And then the second thing is, what was the second?
Well, I was asking about ethical obligation or something.
I don't know. I think that
I mean, in other words, like, what got you in the play?
I wanted to participate in a revolution against austerity in Greece. And then Syriza, which was the government of the left, signed the third memorandum with its creditors. And so the revolution was not on anymore. And I went to Lesvos, which is in the Aegean border. And it was the height of the refugee crisis and also happened to be my home. And at the beginning, there were no state infrastructures there. There was nothing. There were thousands of people who were arriving. There was nobody there. Chiara Towne was there for part of it. And it was a moment in which I think that a lot of mine and Miguel's, and all of our generation became politicized through the fact that all of a sudden these things were happening so close to home. And there was nobody else. And so there was this kind of unmediated sense of wanting to, in part, and it depends where you're from. For us, it was to try to repurpose some of the anti-austerity organizing and forms of mutual aid that we had created around austerity and see whether they can be made to work in migrant solidarity activism. And that's where I met people from Sea-Watch who started, again, I think that, maybe I'm saying this because I just defended my PhD in 2024. But I think like I really can't impress like how young everybody was. Like I was 22, so was Miguel. We're the same age. There were you were 22. I think that to be honest, like I am like Miguel will have a different answer to this. Like I got involved because I thought the revolution could still kind of that there was a continuity in causes that was an anti-capitalist cause, that was an anti-racist cause that could kind of join the battle against austerity in Europe with that for migrants' rights, and that's how I got involved in climate.
Let's. I know Miguel, you wanted in, so why don't you go ahead, Lorenzo, and then Chiara, and then we'll open it up. That's not.
So yeah, I guess to first to kind of try and answer your question in some way. I think, well, all of these critical considerations about the the reasons ultimately that take us to the sea to do this work, like whether this changes or not the work that we do, and I think we can only say no if we consider that the work that we do is fundamentally humanitarian, and I think that's where the mistake lies. I see, and I know Chloe shares the same opinion. I see civil sea rescue as a political project with a humanitarian side to it, but it's fundamentally political before it's humanitarian. So it's not really about that specific person that I'm reaching my hand to take out of the water and save. Of course, that's really important. That's essential. However, the project is political. It's possibly even more important to then take the visibility that we get from doing the work that we do, from specifically rescuing that particular person, and then communicating about it, talking about it, and contesting the system that took that person to that particular situation and put me in a situation in which I had the power to take that person out of the water. Right? So it's not about this or that person. It's about all of the thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who will find themselves in the same situation because the problem is systemic. Right? So it's that we need to contest. And actually, even yesterday, I was having a really interesting conversation with Chloe about this. That this is even a point in which we can criticize NGOs in the work that they do, in the sense that they have at times forgotten that this is their fundamental purpose, the reason why they exist, right? To contest the systems that left these people in these situations. Because it's not that these people are not dying because of some natural disaster. Right? They're put in this place because of for political reasons, and only political action can possibly take them out of that situation. I think civil sea rescue is important politically as long as we don't forget about them.
Thanks. Lorenzo, do you want to jump in?
I mean, yeah, there's so much on the table that I'm not sure exactly where to start, or there's so many points, but maybe in no particular order. One thing that struck me was, this reflection about the relationship between what, non-governmental actors do at sea and what the state does, right? And I think you're right, Chloe, to say that, I mean, probably the thing that has been pissing off most the state is that, it has seen NGOs as well, partly replacing, some of what they had been doing. So this kind of, let's say, strange overlap. And I was mentioning earlier, the admiration as well to see, a lot of, activist groups, let's say, being able in such a short time and in so difficult conditions to acquire so much knowledge and develop their practices in such an extraordinary way. But also, I mean, this does raise, I think, questions about, what is the limit to that in a sense, right? These are questions that I'm not saying as somebody who is kind of criticizing, let's say, these kind of groups or movements from outside. I'm very much part of those discussions and questioning my own role within those. But let's say, you were like, I forget who was saying, like, Sea-Watch going from like a rowboat, like on the pond on the canal to, let's say, huge kind of offshore supply vessel, like 2 planes, 4 reefs and this and that and satellite and so where's the limit, right? I mean, is there a risk in kind of expanding this further and further and further, right? Because it has been, for many of these groups as well, the claim was, we should not be here, right? The state should be doing this. We don't want to be here, but as long as you don't do it, we do it, right? So, I don't have a kind of straight answer, but there is a kind of contradiction there, I feel, which is productive as well, but it's also something to think about. And I think it's, one way to think about this is also to take seriously, that accusation by the state of saying, oh, you are doing what we're doing, but you're doing it, let's say, in a kind of pirate way, to kind of take that pirate accusation in a sense and reclaim it as something that, that can be a statement, right? And I think it's interesting to see how, in fact, a lot of these projects are, they defy a bit the opposition between a kind of consciously political intervention and a supposedly simply kind of humanitarian one, in the sense that, I mean, they still, even when they are not claiming a political goal, they're still kind of altering the conditions of movements in favor of those who are attempting to cross, right? They are contributing to, let's say, practically, to an everyday practice of, let's say, undoing borders, right? Which comes at a lot of, with a lot of risk, with a lot of violence and so on and so forth. So I don't want to romanticize that, but still, there is something inherently somehow subversive, which I think it's useful to remember that.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Chiara, did you want to jump in?
Sure. I was slightly, I'm a bit, no. I know that the question is how to get involved in listening to Lorenzo. I wanted to ask first, but I wanted to let you. Can you have that then?
Yes.
Great. So the brief answer to the question of how I got there actually also has to do with criminalization, is that in October of 2020, which is a period of time that I think all of us can cast our minds back to and understand, we were all very briefly put in a much more similar situation to people who are crossing the Med, in that we were subject to the whims of our own borders, and we couldn't, for the first time in many of our lives, leave the place that we were from, actually, as an experience. And I was in Palermo with Chloe, and COX wanted to do a test flight because basically to see if the pilot was going to get arrested by the Italian government. They landed to see if they could begin the flight after administrative hold, and because no one else was able to cross the borders to get on the plane, I, who happened to be there and happened to be able to use a camera well enough, was put on board, volunteered to get on the plane. And I also have the advantage of being vouched for by somebody that the organization knew was not there to somehow undermine the mission. So I got there by chance, I guess, but also by virtue of the choice of what you would to stay.
Did you want to, something with drones?
I don't want to talk about
You don't
drones.
want,
I
you
want
want,
you
you
to
want,
talk about drones.
yeah.
I think that something that there was a section in the documentary that would have made it too long, that was about the fact that the Frontex, which is the sort of for those of us that don't yet know, there are independent European Coast Guards, and then there's a kind of pan-European Coast Guard. Frontex that is funded by the European Union as a whole, and Frontex flies a drone around the Mediterranean. You can jump in at any time. Yeah. Flies a drone around the Mediterranean and communicates with Warsaw, the seaside town of Warsaw, about what it sees, and that information is then passed often to the Libyan Coast Guard, which is something that is denied by the European Union, but is documented over and over and over again. And also, anecdotally, is something that I heard from every person that I interviewed, which is that we would see, because a lot of these people, everyone was pulled back at least once, if not up to 6 times. And what they would say was, we saw the drone and then we saw the Libyans. Can I make an asterisk? Yeah.
The way that it works is that even before the drones started, the aircraft that leave from Lampedusa, basically it's quite funny the way that we conduct our operations in terms of the cooperation and the anti-cooperation forms of cooperism is that Moonbird, so our aircraft and our old aircraft and the Frontex aircraft would take off like literally meters apart on the runway in Lampedusa. So you'd have kind of the activists like the No Borders aircraft, and you would have the border surveillance aircraft, and we would just be like taking our coffee in the morning, like next to each other, and then we'd like go to the bathroom, and there was like this roll of toilet paper that we used to like hand each other back and forth, and then like we'd get into the aircraft and like we'd wait for the air traffic controller to like assign one of us presidents, but we both knew that we were going to the same place. And that like we were constantly kind of trying to poach information from each other about the coordinates of the boats. Those had human crews, and then there was the shift to the drones, and the drones are part of this kind of border externalization process also in terms of the outsourcing of responsibility, right? And this is one of the ethical questions that came out in drone warfare, is that like, if you're seeing things from above and you don't actually know what's happening and you're not the one who's actually acting on it, so, then where is like this responsibility chain that gets diluted so that the drone is like actually collecting the images. Somebody, a Frontex officer in Malta or Rome or Warsaw, is receiving this and is trying to interpret it and then sending over that information to the Coast Guard, who are then acting on that information. So that kind of like operational split between seeing, interpreting, and acting is part of what accounts for this kind of responsibility laundering of how the work is.
Thanks. Yeah. So I'm going to open it up in just a second. There's one thought that keeps on ringing in my ears, which has something to do with scale. And Miguel, I wonder in part on the questions of the political versus the ethical, if scale is playing a role. Because in my parts of the world, we're dealing predominantly with representing persons who've been condemned to death, the scale is actually different. It's a smaller scale. Even in a state like Alabama, which has got about 180 men and women on death row, who executes 2 or 3 persons, and you work with one person for years. You know, it's almost different, right? Than the drownings that 27,000 people or so drowning over since 2014, in a way creates more of a political dynamic, a political field almost. So I can understand how the political plays a different space in terms of one's relationship to the field. When in fact, in my spaces, it feels much more just a continuing ethical obligation to one person. You know what I mean? But that might be a question of scale, because obviously all of the politics are there as well. It's clear, but somehow what motivates, what drives, what wakes you up in the morning feels to me is different in a way. Okay, so we've got some questions. We're going to take 2 right now. We got Disha and Decca and Lara. That's 3.
Thanks, Chloe and Miguel, and can't see your names, but yeah, you guys are doing amazing work, and I love how you are also debating about so many things that in my head were also some of these debates, and I would like to reiterate some of them. And I think Professor Harcourt sort of provided this link and thread when he discussed politics and when he's also discussing criminalization. To me, I feel like there is this sort of commonsensical idea that humanitarian efforts are apolitical. And what I saw, apolitical, yeah, in a sense that they sort of bring people together, and it's this sort of cooperation and this incredible act of cooperation is sort of, it defies all sorts of political views, and it sort of brings you together. I have sort of thought about criminalization. And when I think about criminalization, I often think that, of course, there's this relationship, as you pointed out, Professor, that between crime and punishment, but often always these entities that are being rescued, quote unquote, are depoliticized in some ways. And I could see from the documentary, an incredible documentary, I could see that the act of defying a regime and the resilience was inherently political, right, on the side of those who were escaping that regime, right? And I see, Chloe, that you mentioned that that you do not agree with Miguel's sort of arguments that this is an extension of the sort of suppression of immigrants, the criminalization of NGOs. But do you think that, considering the sort of power dynamics, there is often always the more powerful in that equation that sort of gets this sort of heroic political sort of, and those who escape it, they're also escaping an incredibly blatantly repressive regime, which is itself an act of political defiance, and they get depoliticized. Are these some of the debates that you all have? Yeah, I'm sure you all are having those debates, but yeah.
Yeah, so it's a great documentary. And all the work you do is like that, like Chloe was saying, like it was like, you know, there's really some powerful seeing how in what you're doing is it's just powerful to see the reactions of the people that you help and also able to interact with and get to know later. So I don't know, just to preface that. But my actual question is really about it's like, as I'm a PhD student in my first year, I find, especially like you, Chloe, getting into what you're doing through the practice, but you talked about humanities, but you're in English and Comparative Literature. That was what you were doing. So really, I mean, probably for I would say all the PhDs, but also we can find somewhere to answer and speak to this as a filmmaker. You spoke about what got you into this work, right? But how did it inform, or maybe vice versa, your PhD work inform what you do, and like how does it merge? How does it blend? And I say that coming as somebody who comes from something. I do a lot of work that's related to media, right? But it's actually for the sole purpose of like this anti-racist agenda in a way. And I think I would just love to hear what you guys think about that.
Thank you. Someone whose refugee family would have died at sea had they not been rescued by non-state actors. Thank you for your important work. My question is with respect to the electorates in Europe. Prior to coming to Colombia, I was living for many years in southern Italy, and I can sense that there's no positive change that's going to occur among the public. And so is this sort of intervention the only hope we have moving forward? Do you see some sort of normative change occurring in the years to come?
About the politics, about the relationship to your work, your theoretical work, your doctoral work, essentially, and your field work in filmmaking, and these questions some of them back to criminalization. Yeah. Who wants to start? Yeah, you want to
Sure.
start?
I mean, yeah, I could start. I think if I'm understanding your question about PhD, I certainly can't speak to, but as far as how it informs a medium like filmmaking, I think that it's really about taking the time. Sort of, it actually kind of relates to what you were saying tonight about taking the time to allow people to be comfortable to speak, which sounds really elementary until you consider the fact that most of these kinds of interviews about the crossing are happening as people are getting off the boat. And it kind of reminds me of like, you watch the sports channel, like ESPN, whatever people do, and you get a reporter going up to somebody and going like, how did you win that game? And they're like, we ran really fast. And there's not a lot of time for people to process. But I think what I found most profound is that people, when they are given an opportunity, really have a lot to say. And that there is no reason why our current media mechanisms can't cover these kinds of situations in a similar way. Obviously, breaking news is breaking news, but there is no reason why people cannot be given the dignity to speak about what they have experienced with a little more time and a little more care. And I think also to figure out how to, I do have another thought about that, but I'm going to pass it over to Chloe.
Okay. Or maybe we'll start with Lorenzo. Do you want to jump in on some of these?
Maybe I could say something very briefly about your question about the theory and practice, because it's also something I've been thinking about and writing a little bit about also in my own PhD thesis, where I was arguing for a form of critical proximity in opposition to, let's say, the critical distance that is normally deemed necessary for kind of scholarly, rigorous, work. And I think, I mean, this also really derives as well, I think, from the group that I've been working with in London, from, Goldsmith and my supervisor, A.R. Weizmann, who has always kind of encouraged us to see this relation, right? And to think about the work that we're doing in class as part of, of other work and vice versa, right? And so I've never really seen or perceived, let's say, a tension between these two moments, but rather the opposite, right? It was always, let's say, theory, I guess, for me, has always emerged as a what to do question, like when faced with, let's say, because the border regime is such a kind of, complex, socially, historically stratified space, with very kind of complex forces that intervene, etc. It required, like some deeper understanding that I felt I didn't have and I could not have if not by going into, reading books and writing about some of these things, right? So for me, it always became, a very kind of practical question that then led to very kind of abstract, maybe theoretical questions, right? But they were always kind of emerging out of the practice in a sense, right? So it was always also about kind of questioning, let's say, this relation between theory and practice in a way that was unsettling a bit both terms and putting them always in dialogue with each other.
Again? So yeah, between the question about the connection between PhD and the work, I think I'm going to skip because mine has nothing to do with this.
Physics, just repeating.
But yeah, I wanted to say a couple of things about the question from back there about the electorates in a lot of countries in Europe. Honestly, I don't see I don't have any positive. I'm not optimistic about what's happening in Europe in terms of the public opinion and also what's happening at a political level in various countries in Europe regarding migrants' rights. But I think that really should make us think, should make us step back a little bit and think what we've done so far and why have we failed so miserably. And honest, I'm convinced that so to bring this back a little bit to the stuff that I said at the beginning, I'm convinced that one of the most important things that we failed is that we've always framed this debate in moral terms. We've always tried to convince the electorate that we need to take people in because it's the morally correct thing to do. And I think that that's a kind of argument, right, as it may be, has completely failed to convince people. I think we should have, from the very beginning, framed this in more honestly in the material, structure that it has, in the sense that I might be a unionized worker in Portugal, and shouting that we shouldn't take in migrants because they make wages drop, for example. But that what that's going to result in ultimately is that capitalists in Portugal are going to convince the government to take in more migrants with less rights, and in the end, there's less and less unionized workers and more migrant workers without rights, right? So this is really the wrong way of looking at things, and I think we can only shift things significantly when we start looking at migrants' rights the way we look at our rights, because they're exactly the same in the sense that so long as there's a migrant that's willing to work for 300 euro, there's no reason why they'll why businesses will hire a Portuguese worker for 800 or 1,000, right? So it's really the moment when we're able to pass laws that will guarantee equal rights, that these people will have the same bargaining power that we do, that native workers do, let's say, and that's how we all gain, I think, not by restricting migrants' ability to cross borders, because that really only changes, that doesn't change their possibility of crossing borders, that just changes the conditions in which they do.
Nice.
Thank you.
Audrey, about your component. But Just briefly, as Miguel was talking, the other thing that I was working on was that in these conversations and interviewing people who are in wildly precarious situations, everyone who I spoke with, I took a lot of care to say, like, there is nothing about having this conversation with me that will help your case. There is nothing about Mike. So I was very clear with everyone that it was not going to immediately help them as an individual reach the next milestone that they needed to reach in their path towards security in Europe. But they were very willing to speak with me anyway. And I think that perhaps if there's a version of, and I'm sure this is true in the United States as well, of a more collaborative approach between what Miguel is suggesting and also getting people on board who are maybe willing to take more risks than we immediately assume in order to push some of these agendas forward.
Thanks, Chiara. Chloe, you're going to address Disha's question.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you for the question. And you're right, we have been thinking about this quite a bit, and especially as regards the criminalization aspect that basically the tools that are used to criminalize NGOs originate in a project of anti-mafia to begin to police the Mediterranean through these criminological paradigms of criminal association, of organized crime. And the people that they most focused on were the boat drivers, were themselves migrants. So the people who were skippering the boats across the Mediterranean that were then accused of being smugglers and involved in the trafficking cartel. And so, yes, you did have the situation, and then that eventually was kind of the idea, the facilitation directive, the idea of aiding and abetting illegal immigration that was used against the boat drivers, then started to be used against the NGOs. And there is a big discussion happening around the fact that, you know, they started criminalizing the NGOs, and we started these huge campaigns about how about we're rescuing lives at sea, and like now states are criminalizing us. Whereas for pretty much for a long period, for every boat that arrived, and many boats arrived, one or two people would be basically automatically sent to jail for 5 years because they were accused of being the boat drivers and so being traffickers, which is just factually inaccurate because most people who drive the boats are just people who couldn't pay the full fare and so had a reduced fare in order to drive the boats. But even if they were driving the boats because they were the boat driver, point is that people wanted to get to Europe and they were at the forefront of that. So you don't want to condemn that. I mean, you don't want to be like, well, he wasn't really driving a boat because he wanted to, but maybe he did want to, and maybe that makes sense. And so one of the things that people did, especially people who were involved in the Juventa case and a few others, was that they started this fund in order to kind of bring more and more publicity to cases that were involving migrant boat drivers so that they would get more media attention, so that they would be kind of more at the forefront of that story. That doesn't mean that they are anywhere near as kind of celebrated as the white middle class Europeans who get criminalized, but nevertheless, like that is, that's something that for at least the past 4 years, people in the civil fleet have been working on. And I think that one place that this film that came out in Italy called Io Capitano that just was at the Oscars, and then I think that it got translated as Me Captain. I'd recommend it. And it's the story about this border crosser who ends up becoming the captain of a boat of about 800 people that gets taken to Europe. And it's very beautiful because it's kind of a celebration of this guy that now that over the past few years, because of the facilitation directive, and part of what I was saying in my notes, the idea that because we became so used to these humanitarian idioms of care, we wanted to kind of, we almost implicitly had to depoliticize the people and say like, oh, look, they're there and we have to rescue them. Rather than being able to say overtly, they're not there by chance. They're there because they wanted to be there in a certain sense. They certainly didn't want to be there under those conditions, but this is part of their project. And so what we're doing is helping them in their project. But that is very dangerous to say, because that's exactly what prosecutors accuse both the NGO fleet and migrants of doing. So the very obvious thing that people don't find themselves there as the result of natural disaster, and they don't find themselves there as a result of circumstance. And it's a political project that is about enabling people to move. It's something that you can't say because you are afraid of spending 25 years in jail. So it's almost that the fact of criminalizing border crossers as celebrating border crossers as political agents itself becomes somehow criminal. And that is like the power of like the censorship and of the intimidation campaign, is that you can't own your heroism that way. It's much better to kind of, it's somehow more palatable if you just remain in these kinds of margins of kind of the humanitarian victim that needs to be saved.
Thanks. Lorenzo, you're writing something down because you were thinking of something. Did you wanted to jump in? Yeah. Okay. All right. So there are lots more hands, and I was gonna go for another round, but I'm really worried that we're kind of getting that it's getting a little bit late, and everybody is gonna come to the pub, hopefully, across the street. So I think maybe the thing to do is to start with apologies. Hope, Ray, Preston, Nikita. Maybe we can continue the conversation at the pub. But it's been a long day, and many people have traveled from far away, and Chloe has defended a dissertation today and has lost her voice. So I think maybe what we'll do is we'll close for right now and continue the conversation at the pub. But before we close, I want to give a big round of thanks and applause to our panelists. Chloe, congratulations. Dr. Haralambous. Thank you, Chiara, for sharing your documentary with us and for previewing it with us. Miguel and Lorenzo, thank you for coming from so far away. Thank you, Kiana, for organizing all of this. You had quite the task. Bringing people in from all over the world. Thank you so much, Kiana, for everything you do and for making this happen. Thanks, Reno, for all the production. Outstanding as always. And thank you all for coming out this evening. And please join us across the street, Arts and Crafts, for drinks at the pub and food. Okay?